They called him dangerous, a scarred rancher, feared by the town, a man who kept everyone at a distance. But when a widow with 3 boys was thrown to the wolves, he did the one thing no one else dared to do. He stood between her and the world. What began as a marriage for protection would soon become a fight for love, justice, and a home neither of them expected to find. This story reminds us that sometimes the strongest love begins not with romance, but with protection, loyalty, and the courage to stay. Welcome to a channel devoted to Western cowboy stories, Frontier Love. If you enjoy stories with heart, grit, and meaning, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The summer heat of Willow Creek baked the dirt into Clara Bennett's skin. But it was the coldness radiating from the pristine oak door in front of her that made her shiver. She had exactly $4.30 in her apron pocket. She had 3 hungry boys pressing against the back of her faded skirts. And she had a folded piece of heavy parchment burning a blister into her heel, hidden deep inside her right leather boot. Arthur's last words before his chest stopped rising had been a frantic, bloody whisper. "Hide the deed, Clara. Don't let Judd find it." The heavy oak door swung open. Judd Bennett stood in the threshold, his suit immaculately pressed, smelling of expensive bay rum and cigars. He looked at Clara first, then his eyes dropped to his dead brother's children. His face didn't soften. It tightened as if someone had tracked mud onto his polished floorboards. "I told you not to come here, Clara," Judd said, his voice a low, smooth drawl that didn't carry past the porch. "Arthur is in the ground, Judd," Clara said, keeping her chin level. "Your brother. We have nowhere else to go. The bank took the house yesterday." Judd sighed, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't invite them in, out of the blistering sun. "I have a reputation in this town. I can't have my brother's destitute widow begging on my doorstep. It's unseemly." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a crisp train ticket. "I bought you passage to St. Louis. The train leaves tomorrow morning. Take the boys back east where you belong." Clara looked at the ticket, her stomach twisting. "I don't know anyone in St. Louis. How are we supposed to live?" "That's not my concern." Judd's eyes narrowed, dropping to the toe of her dusty boot for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her face. "But I'm a reasonable man. Leave Arthur's old land papers with me. That useless acreage out by the ridge. It's sentimental junk, but I'll take the burden of dealing with the county clerks off your hands. Do that, and I'll give you $50 to get settled." The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. The paper in her boot felt suddenly heavier. He didn't want to help them. He wanted the deed, and he was willing to starve his own nephews to get it. "No," Clara said, her voice trembling, but her spine snapping straight. Judd's veneer of civility vanished. His eyes went flat and shark-like. "Suit yourself, but don't expect a single door in Willow Creek to open for you, I make sure of that." He stepped back and shut the door. The heavy click of the lock echoed in the quiet morning air. Clara stood on the porch for 3 full seconds. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had a safe place to fall, and she had nothing but the hard dirt beneath her boots. She turned around, taking 5-year-old Toby's hand. "Come on, boys," she whispered. "Keep your heads up." Across the street, in the deep shade of the general store's awning, Silas Thorne loaded a 100-pound sack of grain into the back of his wagon as if it weighed nothing. He hated town. He hated the noise, the gossip, and the sideways glances the townsfolk gave him. To them, Silas Thorne was a dangerous, solitary fixture of the frontier, a man with too much land, too many scars, and no patience for polite society. He tossed a second sack into the wagon, his jaw locked tight as he watched the scene unfold on the Bennett porch. He saw Judd shut the door. He saw the widow stand there, surrounded by 3 small boys. He saw the exact moment her spine stiffened like a steel rod. She didn't break. She took her youngest boy's hand and walked down the dusty steps, her chin raised in quiet defiance. Silas felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He knew what it looked like when the world turned its back on someone. He knew the specific, terrifying weight of having children to protect and no shelter to offer them. A phantom ache gripped his chest. A ghost from 10 years ago. A fever he couldn't break. A grave he had dug with his own 2 hands. He swore softly under his breath, adjusting the brim of his worn Stetson, and stepped out of the shade. Clara walked down the center of the street. It was as Judd had promised. The townspeople suddenly found the storefronts fascinating. Women she had sat next to in church turned their parasols away. She was calculating how many days of food $4 would buy when a shadow fell over her, blocking out the brutal midday sun. She stopped. The man standing in her path was a mountain of faded denim and worn leather. He had shoulders wide enough to block the alleyway, a jaw covered in dark, rough stubble, and eyes the color of a gathering storm. A jagged, faded scar cut through his left eyebrow. He didn't look like a man who asked for permission. "Ma'am." His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the hot air. 12-year-old Liam instantly stepped in front of Clara, his small fists clenched at his sides. The stranger glanced down at the boy, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his hardened features before he looked back at Clara. "You're in my way, mister," Clara said, her voice tight. "Silas Thorne," he said, not moving. "I run the Silver Creek Ranch, 6 miles north of here." He hooked his thumbs into his gun belt. He didn't offer a polite smile or a word of pity. "I have a crew of ranch hands that eat like feral hogs and a line shack on the edge of my property that's gathering dust. It needs cleaning, and my men need feeding." Clara stared at him. "I don't take charity, Mr. Thorne." "Good, because I'm not offering any," Silas replied evenly. "It's back-breaking work. But there's a stove, a clean well, and a solid roof. The shack is yours if you can keep my crew fed. You and the boys are welcome to whatever is in the larder." Clara studied his face. She looked for the trap, for the hidden cruelty she had just seen in Judd's eyes. But Silas Thorne's gaze was entirely steady, completely devoid of ulterior motives. He wasn't looking at her like a victim. He was looking at her like a prospective ranch hand. "I'll earn my keep, Mr. Thorne," Clara said, her voice fierce. "Every inch of it." "I expect nothing less." Silas tipped his hat. "My wagon's at the feed store. We leave in 10 minutes. He turned and walked away, not looking back to see if she followed. 20 minutes later, the heavy wagon rattled out of Willow Creek. Clara sat rigidly on the wooden bench beside Silas, the space between them humming with unspoken tension. In the wagon bed behind them, the boys sat among the sacks of grain and flour. Silas kept his eyes on the road, his large hands managing the reins with effortless, practiced ease. But as the town faded behind them, he glanced over his broad shoulder. Amidst the grain sacks, Liam sat with his arm wrapped protectively around his youngest brother. The 12-year-old wasn't looking at the passing landscape. He was staring directly at the back of Silas's head. When Silas met his gaze, the boy's eyes were cold, calculating, and burning with a fierce, protective mistrust. Silas turned his eyes back to the dirt road, letting out a slow, silent exhale. He hadn't just hired a cook. He had just hauled a powder keg onto his land, and someone in town was already holding the match. The line shack sat on the eastern edge of the Silver Creek Ranch like a forgotten afterthought. When Silas shoved the warped wooden door open, the smell of dry rot, stale tobacco, and trapped heat rolled out to greet them. Clara didn't flinch. She stepped over the threshold, her eyes scanning the single room. There was a rusted cast-iron stove, a scarred wooden table, and a pair of narrow, lumpy cots. Dust motes danced thickly in the shafts of sunlight bleeding through the cracked window panes. "It ain't a parlor," Silas said from the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. He didn't offer apologies. "Well's out back, wood piles chopped. The hands eat at dawn and sundown in the main barn." "We'll manage," Clara said, rolling up the sleeves of her faded dress. Silas nodded once, tipped his hat to the boys, and walked away. For the next week, Clara waged war on the dirt and the despair. She scrubbed the floorboards with lye until her knuckles bled. She hauled buckets of water from the well, the rope biting into her blistered palms. At dawn, she marched to the cookhouse and faced down 7 hardened, filthy ranch hands. She didn't smile. She didn't bat her eyelashes. She slammed heavy cast-iron skillets of bacon, black coffee, and biscuits onto the long wooden table with a look that dared any man to complain. By the 3rd day, the men stopped grumbling about a woman in camp. By the 5th, they were taking their hats off when she walked into the room. Silas kept his distance. Clara only ever saw him as a silhouette on horseback against the ridge, or heard the low, authoritative rumble of his voice in the corral. Yet every morning Clara found a fresh stack of chopped kindling by her door, and once a small wooden carving of a horse left specifically at Caleb's eye level. The uneasy peace shattered on a Tuesday night. The air had turned thick and suffocating, the sky bruised purple with a looming summer storm. Clara was sitting by the lantern, carefully mending Liam's torn shirt, when a sound from the corner cot made her freeze. It was a wet, ragged wheeze. Clara dropped the needle and rushed to the cot. 5-year-old Toby was thrashing against the thin wool blanket. His face was flushed crimson, slick with sweat, and his small chest heaved violently. When Clara pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin burned her like a stove iron. "Mama?" Liam whispered from the other cot, his voice tight with sudden terror. "Is he okay?" "Fetch the water bucket, Liam. Hurry!" Clara ordered, trying to keep the panic out of her throat. She soaked a rag and pressed it to Toby's neck, but the boy whimpered, his eyes rolling back in his head. It wasn't a summer cold, it was a deadly consuming fever, and Clara had absolutely nothing to fight it with. A crack of thunder shook the shack, rattling the glass in the windows. Rain began to lash against the roof in violent sheets. Clara didn't hesitate. "Stay with Caleb. Keep the rag wet," she told Liam. She threw open the door and ran into the deluge. The mud sucked at her boots and the freezing rain plastered her hair to her face, but she sprinted the 100 yards to the main house. She pounded both fists against the heavy front door until her hands went numb. The door wrenched open. Silas stood there in his dark trousers and a half-buttoned shirt, a revolver gripped loosely in his right hand. "My son," Clara gasped, pointing back into the dark. "Toby, he's burning up, he can't breathe." Silas didn't ask questions. He shoved the gun into his waistband, grabbed a lantern, and followed her out into the blinding storm. When they burst into the line shack, the only sound was the drumming rain and Toby's terrible, rattling gasps. Silas stepped toward the bed, raising the lantern. The yellow light washed over the sick child. Silas stopped dead. Clara turned to look at him and felt her breath catch. The stone-cold, unflappable cowboy was gone. Silas was staring at Toby, but his eyes were wide, unseeing, locked on a nightmare only he could see. The lantern in his hand began to shake violently, casting wild shadows against the walls. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his brow, mingling with the rain. Cholera. The memory hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. The heat of the skin, the frantic breathing, the absolute crushing helplessness of watching the life drain out of the people he was supposed to protect. It wasn't Toby in that bed, it was his son. 10 years ago, slipping away while Silas begged a God who wasn't listening. "Silas?" Clara touched his arm. His muscles were locked as tight as coiled wire. "Silas, what is it?" Her touch snapped him back to the present. He blinked hard, sucking in a jagged breath of the damp air. The ghost retreated, leaving behind a fierce, violent need to make sure history did not repeat itself on his land. He didn't say a word to Clara. He turned on his heel and bolted out the door. Clara ran to the window. Through the flashes of lightning, she saw Silas sprint to the corral. He didn't bother saddling his massive black gelding. He threw a bridle over the panicked animal's head, vaulted onto its bare back, and kicked it into a dead sprint. He rode straight into the teeth of the lightning storm, a lone shadow racing against the grim reaper toward Willow Creek. He returned 2 hours later, the local doctor slung over the back of a second horse, both men soaked to the bone and covered in mud. Silas didn't step inside the shack. He stood on the porch in the pouring rain, his jaw clenched, standing guard in the dark until the doctor finally emerged at dawn and nodded. The fever had broken. Clara stepped out onto the porch, a weary blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Silas was leaning against the porch post, water dripping from his hat brim. He looked exhausted, stripped down to the raw nerve. "He's going to live," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you." Silas didn't look at her. He pulled his hat down lower to hide his eyes, tipped the brim, and walked away into the gray morning mist. 3 days later, the storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, suffocating heat that baked the mud back into cracked earth. Toby was sitting up, eating weak broth, while Caleb and Liam kept a vigilant watch over him. Clara stepped out of the line shack, carrying a basket of wet laundry, and stopped cold. Nailed directly into the center of the heavy wooden door, exactly at Clara's eye level, was a 6-foot-long western diamondback rattlesnake. It was dead, its head crushed, but its thick-scaled body hung limp over the threshold. Pinned beneath the rusted nail was a torn scrap of a flour sack. Clara dropped the laundry basket. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. Silas walked up, his eyes instantly locking onto the gruesome display. The temperature in the yard seemed to drop 10 degrees as he stepped past Clara and ripped the scrap of fabric from the nail. Scrawled in crude charcoal were 3 words: "Whore, get out." Silas's jaw locked so hard Clara thought his teeth might shatter. "Harlan Vance," he growled, the name sounding like a curse. "Who?" Clara asked, wrapping her arms around her waist to stop the sudden chill. "A hand I fired last month for taking a whip to a lame horse," Silas said. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt and cut the snake down, tossing it into the brush. "He drinks with your brother-in-law in town. Looks like Judd found himself a stray dog to do his biting." "I need supplies for the boys," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I have to go into town today." "I'll ride with you," Silas said immediately. "No," Clara met his stormy gaze. "If I hide behind you, they'll know they scared me. I'll take the wagon. I can face a few whispers." And she underestimated the poison Judd Bennett had poured into Willow Creek. When Clara walked into the general store 2 hours later, the lively chatter died instantly. Women at the fabric counter turned their backs. The store owner, a balding man named Miller, who had sold Clara peppermint sticks for her children just a month ago, refused to meet her eyes. Clara placed a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a bottle of children's cough syrup on the counter. She pulled out her $4. Miller wiped his sweating forehead with an apron. "Can't take your money, Mrs. Bennett." "I'm paying cash, Mr. Miller, not asking for credit." "I said I can't take it," Miller hissed, glancing nervously toward the window. "Judd Bennett owns the bank that holds the deed to this store. He said if I serve the woman living in sin out at the Thorn place, he'll call in my loans." Miller swallowed hard. "I have a family, Clara. I'm sorry. Get out." Clara stood frozen. The whispers from the back of the store slithered into her ears. Arthur barely cold in the ground, living like an animal with that scarred brute. Those poor boys, exposed to such filth. Clara left the flour and the medicine. She walked out of the store with her head held high, climbed into the wagon, and drove the 6 miles back to the ranch with her spine perfectly straight. It wasn't until she reached the safety of the Silver Creek property that the adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow, aching void. She stopped the wagon by the old stone well behind the main barn, out of sight of the line shack. She climbed down, grabbed the heavy wooden bucket, and tried to lower it into the dark water. Her hands began to shake. The rope slipped, burning her palms, and the bucket crashed into the stones below. The sound broke her. Clara sank to her knees in the dust, pressing her forehead against the cool, rough stones of the well. A single ragged sob tore its way up her throat. She clamped both hands over her mouth, refusing to let the boys hear her cry. But the tears came anyway, hot, angry, and born of utter exhaustion. The world was closing its fist around her, and she had nowhere left to run. From the shadows of the hayloft, Silas stood perfectly still. He watched her shoulders shake. He watched a woman made of iron finally bend under the weight of a town's cruelty. Every protective instinct he had buried in the graveyard 10 years ago roared back to life, white-hot and violent. He didn't climb down to comfort her. Comfort wasn't what Clara Bennett needed. She needed a shield. Silas turned, climbed down the ladder, and saddled his black gelding. An hour later, Silas Thorne kicked open the back door of the Willow Creek Sheriff's office. Sheriff Hayes, a bloated man who smelled of cheap whiskey, jumped up from his desk, his hand reaching for his sidearm. He never made it. Silas crossed the room in 3 massive strides, grabbed the sheriff by the front of his shirt, and slammed him backward against the wall so hard the wanted posters fluttered to the floor. "Silas, have you lost your damn mind?" Hayes choked out, his boots dangling an inch off the floor. "What is Judd Bennett planning?" Silas's voice was a deadly quiet rasp. "He cut off her food. Vance nailed a snake to my door." "What's the end game, Hayes?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Silas tightened his grip, cutting off the man's windpipe. "Lie to me again, and I'll throw you through that front window." Hayes clawed at Silas's wrist, his face turning purple. "The courts," he wheezed. "Tomorrow morning." Judd filed a petition with the circuit judge. Morals clause. He's claiming Clara is an unfit mother living as a harlot on your land. Silas froze. "He's trying to take her boys." "The judge is in Judd's pocket," Hayes gasped. "He'll sign the order at noon tomorrow. The boys go to the county orphanage, and Judd gets named legal executor of Arthur's remaining estate. It's done, Thorne. You can't shoot a judge." Silas dropped the sheriff. Hayes crumpled to the floor, coughing violently. Silas stood in the center of the dusty office, his mind calculating with cold, lethal precision. Hayes was right. A gun couldn't stop a gavel. Judd was using the law to strip Clara of the only thing she lived for. To beat Judd Bennett, Silas couldn't fight like an outlaw. He had to use the one thing the town couldn't contest. He had to give Clara an armor made of paper and ink, backed by the most feared name in the territory. Silas turned and strode out the door, his spurs ringing like a death knell on the wooden boardwalk. He had a proposal to make. Silas rode the black gelding hard, pushing the beast until white lather coated its neck. The 6 miles from Willow Creek to the ranch blurred into a haze of heat and dust. His mind was a cold, calculating machine, turning over Sheriff Hayes's words. Unfit mother. County orphanage. Noon tomorrow. He found Clara in the barn. She was wrestling with a broken stall gate, wielding a heavy iron hammer that was too big for her. Sweat plastered stray strands of hair to her forehead, and her knuckles were scraped raw and bleeding, but she swung the hammer with a punishing rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. Silas dismounted, his boots hitting the packed dirt with a heavy thud. He walked over, reached out his large, calloused hand and wrapped his fingers around the hammer's handle, stopping her mid-swing. Clara whipped her head around, her chest heaving. "I'm fixing it," she said defensively, her eyes daring him to criticize her work. "Leave the gate, Clara," Silas said. His voice was dangerously quiet. She let go of the hammer, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of dirt and blood. "What happened? Did Miller let you buy the flour?" "Judd isn't trying to starve you out," Silas said, stripping away the pleasantries because they didn't have the time. "He's going to the circuit judge tomorrow at noon. He filed a morals petition. Because you're living on a bachelor's ranch, he's having you declared an unfit mother. He's taking the boys, Clara. He's putting them in the county orphanage, and he's seizing Arthur's estate as their legal guardian." The color drained from Clara's face so fast Silas thought she might faint. She took a stumbling step backward, her hand flying to her throat. No, he can't. They're my children. The judge owes Judd money. He'll sign the order. Panic, pure and suffocating, seized Clara's features. She spun toward the barn doors, looking toward the line shack where her sons were. We have to leave. I'll pack the wagon. We can make the territory line by tomorrow night if we drive the horses hard. If you run, you're a fugitive, Silas cut in, stepping into her path to ground her. Judd will wire the U.S. Marshals. They'll hunt you down, drag you back in irons, and hand Liam, Caleb, and Toby over to him before the week is out. Then what do I do? Clara cried, her voice finally breaking. She grabbed the front of Silas's canvas coat, her small, bloodied hands twisting the fabric. Tell me how to fight him, Silas. I will shoot him myself if I have to, but I will not let him take my boys. Silas looked down at her. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror of a mother cornered by a predator. He felt the phantom weight of his own failures pressing against his ribs. He couldn't save his first family from the fever, but he could save this one from Judd Bennett. Silas reached up and gently curled his large hands over her trembling fists, unclenching them from his coat. He didn't let go of her hands. Go. He took a step back, pulling a match from his vest pocket. He struck it against the rough heel of his boot. The sulfur flared bright in the dim barn. He brought the flame to a thin cheroot between his teeth, taking a slow drag before tossing the match into the dirt and crushing it beneath his heel. He looked her dead in the eye through the dissipating smoke. I don't know how to be a husband, Clara, Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for doubt. That part of me died 10 years ago. I don't have soft words, and I don't know how to build a normal family. But my name... He stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking out the light from the barn doors, casting her entirely in his shadow. My name carries enough lead and land that no man in this county will dare cross it. Not a corrupt judge, and sure as hell not Judd Bennett. If you're my wife, you're untouchable. Take my name. It's a wall they won't breach. Clara stared at him, her breath hitching. She looked at the rugged, scarred cowboy standing before her. He wasn't offering her a romance. He was offering his life as a human shield. He was stepping into the line of fire for 3 boys that weren't his, and a woman he barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. The terror in Clara's chest dissolved, replaced by a profound, overwhelming awe. Rejected by the world, a cowboy looked her in the eyes and told her she was safe. And for the first time since Arthur died, Clara actually believed it. She lifted her chin, her brown eyes hardening into polished agate. Then we build the wall, Mr. Thorne. The Willow Creek Town Hall smelled of floor wax and stale cigar smoke. At 11:15 a.m., 45 minutes before Judd's appointment with the circuit judge, Clara stood before the bewildered justice of the peace. She wore her faded gray wool dress. Silas stood beside her, clad in a dark suit that barely contained his broad shoulders. A Colt, .45 strapped unapologetically to his thigh. Liam stood fiercely at Clara's side while Caleb held Toby's hand. Do you, Silas Thorne, take this woman? The justice stammered, his eyes darting nervously to the heavy revolver on Silas's hip. I do, Silas said. The words fell like iron anvils in the quiet room. And do you, Clara Bennett? I do. Then sign here. Clara's hand didn't tremble as she took the fountain pen. She signed Clara Thorne, the ink still shining wet when the heavy double doors of the town hall slammed open with a deafening crack. Judd Bennett stormed into the room, flanked by Sheriff Hayes. Judd's face was a mask of aristocratic fury. Stop this immediately, Justice! Put that pen down. Silas didn't flinch. He casually stepped in front of Clara, smoothly cutting off Judd's line of sight to her. The subtle, effortless movement of a predator shielding its own. You're late, Judd, Silas drawled, picking up the marriage certificate and folding it into his breast pocket. Court's closed. Judd's eyes bulged as he looked from Silas to the justice. Is this true? You married this vagrant to a killer? Watch your mouth, Silas warned, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a lethal edge that made the hair on the back of Hayes's neck stand up. "You're speaking about my wife and my sons. You step foot on Silver Creek land, or you look at them sideways in town, and I won't bother with the sheriff. I'll bury you where you stand. Are we clear?" Judd sneered, adjusting his lapels with shaking hands. "You think a piece of paper changes anything, Thorne? You're delaying the inevitable." He spun on his heel and marched out, Hayes scurrying behind him. Silas turned back to Clara. "Pack the wagon. You're moving into the main house." The Silver Creek main house was a sprawling, sturdy structure of thick timber and riverstone. It was immaculately clean, but painfully empty. A house that hadn't heard a woman's footsteps or a child's laugh in a decade. Clara immediately felt the weight of the ghosts. Silas carried their meager trunk inside. "The master bedroom is yours," he told Clara, pointing down the hall. "The boys can take the 2 guest rooms across from it." "Where are your things?" Clara asked, noticing the lack of personal items. "I set up a cot in the tack room of the barn," Silas said, not meeting her eyes. "I'll take my meals with the hands. The house is yours." Before Clara could argue, he tipped his hat and walked out the door. The boundary was set in stone. He would protect them, but he would not let them in. 4 days later, the simmering tension of their arrangement reached a boiling point. Clara was in the kitchen peeling potatoes when Liam burst through the back door, pale and breathless. "Silas got hurt. A wild bronc pinned him against the corral fence. He's in the barn." Clara dropped the knife and ran. She found Silas sitting on an overturned crate in the dim light of the tack room. His shirt was off, pooled around his waist. A brutal, jagged gash tore across his right shoulder blade, bleeding sluggishly down his heavily muscled back. He was trying awkwardly to pour iodine over his own shoulder, his jaw locked in a grimace. "Stop," Clara ordered, stepping into the small room. Silas stiffened at the sound of her voice. "It's fine, Clara. Go back to the house." "You can't reach it, you stubborn mule," she shot back, grabbing the bottle of iodine and a clean rag from his hands. "Sit still." Silas froze as Clara stepped behind him. The tack room was suffocatingly small, smelling of old leather, hay, and the sharp tang of copper blood. Clara pressed the iodine-soaked rag to the gash. Silas sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth, the massive muscles of his back cording with tension. As she cleaned the wound, her knuckles brushed against his bare skin. He was burning hot, his body radiating a raw, masculine heat that made Clara's pulse hammer in her throat. She noticed the other scars then, faded white lines crisscrossing his ribs, the history of a violent, hard-fought life. She traced the edge of the fresh wound with a surprisingly gentle touch. "I need to stitch it," she whispered, her voice sounding entirely too loud in the quiet barn. "Do it," Silas grunted, his hands gripping the edges of the crate until his knuckles turned white. He was hyper-aware of her every breath, of the soft rustle of her skirts against his knee, of the delicate, capable hands trailing over his ruined skin. It was a terrifying, intoxicating vulnerability. Clara threaded a needle and began to sew. She worked quickly, leaning in close. Silas closed his eyes, his breathing growing shallow as he fought the sudden, violent urge to turn around, pull her into his lap, and bury his face in her neck. The sheer physical magnetism between them was a live wire sparking in the dusty air. When she tied off the final suture, her fingers lingered on his shoulder for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Done," she breathed, stepping back quickly to break the spell. Silas stood up, pulling a clean shirt over his shoulders without looking at her. "Thank you," he said gruffly. Later that night, the house was dead silent. The boys were asleep. Silas was resting in the barn. Clara sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of an oil lamp casting long shadows across the room. She reached down, unlaced her right boot, and pulled out the folded parchment. She smoothed it out on the table. She had kept it hidden, afraid to understand why Judd wanted it so badly. But she was Clara Thorne now. She had a wall. She walked out into the cool night air and crossed the yard to the barn. Silas was sitting up on his cot, nursing a glass of whiskey, his stitched shoulder resting against the wood paneling. He looked up as she stepped into the lantern light. Clara didn't say a word. She walked over and handed him the parchment. Silas frowned, setting his glass down. He unfolded the heavy paper. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, tracing the topographical map drawn at the bottom. As he read, the blood seemed to drain from his face. "Where did you get this?" Silas demanded, looking up at her sharply. "Arthur gave it to me right before he died. He told me to hide it from Judd." Clara crossed her arms. "What is it, Silas?" "Judd said it was useless acreage out by the ridge." "It's not useless," Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He stood up, bringing the map closer to the lantern. "I know this land. It sits in the valley basin just north of town. Clara, this deed claims the mineral and water rights to the deep underground aquifer. It's the only guaranteed water source for 50 miles, if a drought hits." Clara stared at him, the pieces clicking together in her mind. "Judd owns the bank. He's been buying up ranches." "If he controls the water, he controls the entire county," Silas said, his eyes darkening with a terrifying realization. "Whoever owns this paper is going to be the richest man in the territory. It's in Arthur's name." The silence in the barn was deafening. "Arthur was an expert horseman," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as the horror washed over her. "He didn't just fall off his gelding that night, did he?" Silas looked at the paper, then at Clara. The stakes had just shifted from a bitter family dispute over custody to cold-blooded murder. "No," Silas said, his hand dropping to the butt of his revolver. "He didn't fall. He was murdered for this. And Judd knows you have it." The gunshot was a sharp, solitary crack that split the dead of night. Clara bolted upright in the master bed, the heavy quilts falling away. For a second, there was only the ringing silence of the prairie. Then came a sound she felt in her teeth before she heard it with her ears. A low, rhythmic rumble vibrating through the thick timber floorboards. It sounded like rolling thunder, but the sky outside the window was perfectly clear, dusted with cold, indifferent stars. The rumble deepened into a roar. Silas's boots hit the hallway floorboards hard enough to rattle the picture frames. He threw open Clara's door, a Winchester rifle already gripped in his hand, his chest bare and heaving. "Get the boys up!" Silas bellowed over the rising din. "Now!" "What is it?" Clara scrambled out of bed, grabbing her boots. "Stampede!" Silas snarled, his eyes wild as he looked out the north window. 500 head of cattle, blind with panic, heading straight for the house. Clara ran to the window. In the moonlight, a massive, churning cloud of dust was rolling over the ridge. Beneath it, a sea of horns and dark, surging muscle was tearing the earth apart. They were moving at a dead sprint, funneled by the canyon walls directly toward the Silver Creek main house. Harlan Vance. He hadn't just fired a gun to spook them. He had deliberately driven the herd toward the only structure in the valley. "Liam!" Clara screamed, sprinting across the hall. The boys were already awake, terrified by the shaking floor. "Get Caleb and Toby. Get under the heavy oak dining table and do not move. Do you hear me? Do not move." "Silas!" Liam yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "They're going to crush the house." "Not tonight they aren't," Silas swore. He turned to Clara, throwing her a second rifle from the gun cabinet in the hall. "I have to split the herd before they hit the perimeter fence. I need to turn the leaders." "You can't do it alone," Clara said, her voice shaking but her grip on the heavy Winchester ironclad. She didn't wait for his permission. She ran past him out the back door and sprinted for the corral in her nightgown and boots. Silas cursed the heavens, but he didn't stop her. They threw saddles onto the black gelding and a sturdy roan mare in a matter of seconds. The roar of the approaching herd was deafening now, drowning out thought, shaking the very air in their lungs. The smell of pulverized dirt and panicked animal sweat hit them like a physical wall. "Stay on my right flank," Silas roared over the noise, vaulting into the saddle. "Fire into the air. You have to turn the lead steers to the east, toward the creek." Clara kicked her mare into a brutal gallop. They rode out of the yard and straight into the teeth of the nightmare. The dust was thick and choking, blinding Clara as she rode into the churning chaos. The ground beneath her horse shuddered violently. A wall of frantic, 1,000-pound beasts charged out of the dark, their eyes rolling white, horns clashing in a deadly rhythm. Silas rode like a demon born of the dust. He spurred the black gelding directly at the center of the herd, cracking a heavy leather bullwhip that sounded like cannon fire. Clara flanked him. A massive, terrified steer broke from the pack, veering dangerously close to her mare. Clara leveled the Winchester with one hand, braced the stock against her hip, and pulled the trigger. The loud crack and the flash of muzzle fire inches from its face sent the steer violently to the right. "Hiya!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing her throat as she fired again, pushing the herd. For 10 agonizing, breathless minutes, they rode a razor's edge between life and being trampled into dust. They fired their rifles until the barrels burned their hands. Silas whipped and shouted, cutting his horse brutally back and forth, forcing the lead steers to veer off their suicidal path. Slowly, agonizingly, the front of the herd began to turn. The mass of cattle curved east, thundering past the ranch house, missing the wooden porch by less than 20 yards. The wooden beams groaned, the windows rattled, but the house stood firm. As the last of the herd thundered toward the creek, the dust began to settle, drifting down like gray snow in the moonlight. Clara pulled back on the reins, her mare dancing nervously, blowing hard. Clara's hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped the empty rifle. Her lungs burned, coated in dirt. Silas reined his black gelding in beside her. His chest was heaving, slick with sweat and dust, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at the house, still standing, the boys safe inside. Then he looked at Clara. She was covered in soot, her nightgown torn, her eyes wide and wild with the pure adrenaline of survival. She had not panicked. She had not run. She had ridden straight into hell right beside him. The tether holding Silas Thorne's legendary control finally snapped. He didn't think. He slid off his horse, reached up, and pulled Clara down from her saddle. Her boots had barely touched the dirt before his hands tangled in her hair, pulling her face to his. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't polite. It was hard, desperate, and completely consuming. A raw, violent collision of two people who had just stared death in the face and won. Clara gasped against his mouth, but she didn't pull away. She dropped the rifle into the dirt and threw her arms around his neck, her fingers digging into the heavy muscles of his shoulders. She kissed him back with a fierce, answering heat, pouring all her terror, her gratitude, and her unspoken, terrifying longing into him. For one breathless minute in the settling dust, there was no Judd Bennett. There was no forged paper, no past ghosts. There was only the solid, burning reality of Silas Thorne's arms holding her exactly where she belonged. The morning after the stampede broke cold and quiet. Clara woke in her bed, her muscles aching and her lips still bruised and sensitive from the sheer force of Silas's kiss. A warm, terrifying hope fluttered in her chest as she walked into the kitchen, expecting to find him at the table. The kitchen was empty. The coffee pot was stone cold. She found Silas out by the corral, tossing bales of hay to the surviving horses. The sun was just peeking over the ridge, casting long, harsh shadows. As Clara approached, Silas didn't turn around. His entire body was locked in a rigid, impenetrable stance. "Silas?" she said softly. "The boys are safe," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the gravelly warmth from the night before. He kept his back to her. "I've sent 2 hands to track Harlan Vance. They won't find him, but it'll keep the perimeter clear." Clara stopped by the fence, the hope in her chest twisting into a hard knot. "Silas, look at me." He threw a pitchfork into the dirt and finally turned. His eyes were completely shuttered. The man who had kissed her with such desperate need in the dark was gone, replaced by the stone-cold, isolated cowboy she had met in town. "What happened last night was a mistake, Clara," he said, the words clipping off his tongue like ice. "It was the adrenaline. It won't happen again." Clara felt a flush of hot, indignant anger rise to her cheeks. "A mistake?" You think that was just adrenaline? I told you from the start what this was, Silas said, stepping back as if her proximity burned him. It's a wall. It's a piece of paper to keep Judd away. Nothing more. You're lying, Clara fired back, closing the distance between them. I felt your heart beating, Silas Thorne. You're terrified. Damn right I am, Silas roared, the sudden explosion of volume making the horses spook. He stripped off his leather gloves and threw them onto the fence rail, his chest heaving. I watched you ride into a stampede. 100 different ways you could have been crushed into the dirt, and I couldn't stop it. If Harlan had shot you, if those steers had hit the house. He broke off, dragging a trembling hand over his face. When he looked at her again, his eyes were haunted. 10 years ago, I came back from a cattle drive and found my wife and my little girl dead in their beds. The fever took them in 3 days, and I wasn't there to stop it, Silas confessed, his voice a ragged whisper. I dug their graves. I buried them. And I swore to God I would never, ever put myself in a position to feel that kind of pain again. Clara's heart broke for him, her anger melting into deep, aching sorrow. Silas, you can't live your life expecting everyone to die. We survived last night. Survived last because I got lucky, Silas said bitterly. He turned away, grabbing his saddle from the top rail. I'm riding out to the north pastures. I need to check the fencing the herd tore through. I won't be back until tomorrow. He was running. Silas, don't walk away from me, Clara yelled. He didn't listen. He saddled the black gelding in record time, swung up and rode out without a backward glance, leaving Clara standing alone in the dust. From the shadows of the barn doors, 12-year-old Liam watched the cowboy ride away. Liam had seen the kiss last night. He had seen the way Silas looked at his mother, like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. And he had just heard every word of the argument. Liam's jaw tightened. He walked quietly into the tack room, grabbed a hackamore, and marched out to the small, stubborn roan pony Silas had taught him to ride. An hour later, Silas was 3 miles north of the house, hammering a fence post into the hard ground with brutal, punishing strikes. He was trying to beat the memory of Clara's kiss out of his head when he heard the steady thump-thump of approaching hooves. Silas stopped, his hand dropping to his colt, expecting Harlan Vance. Instead, a small roan pony crested the ridge. Liam was in the saddle, sitting ramrod straight, his face set in a furious scowl. "What the hell are you doing out here, boy?" Silas barked, dropping the hammer. "It's not safe." Liam didn't dismount. He rode right up to Silas, looking down at the giant cowboy. The boy's hands were shaking slightly on the reins, but his eyes, Arthur's eyes, were blazing. "My dad left us," Liam said, his voice cracking on the first word, but he forced it steady. "He went chasing a payday out on the ridge, and it got him killed. He left my mom alone to deal with Judd." Silas frowned, stepping closer to the pony. "Liam, go back to the house." "No," Liam shouted. "You listen to me. My dad left, but you stayed. When the fever hit Toby, you rode into a lightning storm. When the herd came, you rode in front of the house. You fight for us." Liam swiped angrily at a tear that escaped down his dirt-smudged cheek. "My mom is the strongest person I know. But she cries when she thinks Caleb and Toby can't hear her. She didn't cry last night when you kissed her. She smiled this morning." Liam leaned forward over the saddle horn, his gaze piercing right through Silas's armor. "You're the real man here, Silas. So stop acting like a coward and go home to my mother." Silas stood frozen, the boy's words hitting him harder than a physical blow. Stop acting like a coward. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that keeping his distance made him strong. That isolation was a virtue. But looking at the fierce, brave 12-year-old boy in front of him, Silas realized the truth. He wasn't protecting Clara and the boys by pulling away. He was just protecting himself. Silas let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs for a decade. He looked at Liam and gave a single slow nod of profound respect. "You're right," Silas said softly. "I'm a damn fool, Liam." Silas turned, whistling sharply for the black gelding. "Come on, we're going home." They rode back toward the Silver Creek main house at a fast canter. Silas's heart was hammering, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was out of a desperate, urgent need to find Clara, to pull her into his arms and to tell her he was done running. But as they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch yard, Silas violently hauled back on the reins, his horse rearing with a panicked whinny. The heavy front gates of the ranch yard had been smashed open, the wood splintered and dragging in the dirt. Silas's blood ran cold. "Liam, stay back," Silas ordered, drawing his Colt as he kicked his horse into a dead sprint. He slid off the gelding before it even stopped in the yard, his boots hitting the ground running. The front door of the main house was wide open. Inside, a chair was overturned. A shattered coffee cup lay in pieces on the floorboards. Caleb and Toby were huddled in the corner of the kitchen, both boys pale and trembling. "Caleb!" Silas dropped to his knees, his massive hands gently gripping the boy's shoulders. "Where is she? Where is your mother?" Caleb looked up, his eyes wide with terror. "Uncle Judd came. He had the sheriff with him. And the bad man with the scar. They grabbed her, Silas. They threw her in the back of her wagon and took her toward town." Silas stood up. The silence in the house was deafening save for the blood roaring in his ears. The fear that had kept him isolated for 10 years burned away in a single second, leaving behind nothing but cold, unadulterated, lethal rage. Judd Bennett hadn't just taken Silas Thorne's wife, he had signed his own death warrant. The shattered remains of the ceramic coffee cup crunched beneath Silas Thorne's heavy leather boots. He stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence of the violated house ringing in his ears. For 10 years, Silas had lived with a cold, dormant ash in his chest, convinced that the fire of losing his family had burned him out completely. But as he looked at the splintered doorframe and the terrified faces of Caleb and Toby huddled in the corner, that ash ignited into a roaring, blinding inferno. He didn't panic. Panic was for men who didn't know how to kill. Silas possessed a terrifying, preternatural calm when violence was the only language left to speak. He dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with Caleb and Toby. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He placed a massive, calloused hand on each of their small shoulders, grounding them. "Are either of you hurt?" Silas asked, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the room. Caleb shook his head, his lower lip trembling. "No, sir, but Uncle Judd." He grabbed Mama by the hair. He dragged her out. Silas's jaw locked so hard the muscles jumped beneath his scarred cheek. "Where is Liam?" "Here." Silas turned. Liam stood in the doorway of the hallway, his face pale, but his jaw set in a rigid imitation of Silas's own stoic expression. The 12-year-old was holding a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white. Silas stood up to his full, intimidating height. He walked past the kitchen table, opened the heavy oak gun cabinet, and bypassed the hunting rifles. He reached for the polished, heavy steel of a Colt single-action Army revolver, a peacemaker. He checked the cylinder, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded with heavy .45 caliber lead, and snapped it shut with a sharp metallic clack. He turned and walked over to Liam. Silas took the iron poker out of the boy's hands and tossed it aside. Then he held out the heavy revolver, grip first. Liam stared at the gun, his eyes widening. "You take this," Silas commanded, his voice devoid of any coddling. "You lock this front door. You pull the heavy dining table in front of it. You keep Caleb and Toby behind you. And you do not open this door for anyone except me or your mother. Do you understand me, Liam?" Liam swallowed hard, the weight of the steel anchoring him to the floor. He looked up into the stormy, lethal eyes of his stepfather. "Yes, Silas. If anyone tries to break through that wood, you point this at the center of their chest and you pull the trigger. You are the man of this house until I get back." Silas rested a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing once. "I'm going to bring her home." Silas turned and walked out the door. He didn't run to the barn. His strides were long, measured, and purposeful. He saddled the black gelding in under a minute, sliding his Winchester rifle into the leather scabbard and strapping a second gun belt across his chest. When Silas rode out of the Silver Creek gates, he didn't ride like a rancher. He rode like the angel of death, a dark shadow cutting across the sun-baked prairie, following the fresh, deep ruts of Clara's wagon wheels cut into the dust. 5 miles away, the brutal midday sun beat down on the desolate, jagged rocks of Willow Creek Canyon. It was a barren stretch of the territory, an abandoned stagecoach relay station that had been left to rot years ago. The canyon walls swallowed the wind, leaving the air thick, stagnant, and suffocatingly hot. Clara was thrown violently from the back of her own wagon. She hit the dust hard, scraping her palms and tearing the knee of her dress, but she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. She scrambled back, pushing herself up against the splintered wheel of the wagon, her chest heaving as she glared at the men surrounding her. Judd Bennett stood a few feet away, meticulously dusting off his tailored suit jacket with a silk handkerchief. He looked entirely out of place in the dirt, a predator masquerading as a gentleman. To his left stood Sheriff Hayes, sweating profusely, his eyes darting nervously up toward the canyon ridges. The sheriff's hand hovered over his holster, a man clearly realizing that he had crossed the invisible line from civil corruption into felony kidnapping. And leaning against the abandoned station's rotting porch post was Harlan Vance. The scarred, unkempt ranch hand casually cleaned his fingernails with a hunting knife, an ugly, sadistic smile twisting his lips. "This is a mistake, Judd," Sheriff Hayes muttered, wiping a river of sweat from his brow. "You said we were just going to serve her a court order. You didn't say nothing about dragging her out of Thorne's house by her hair. If Silas Thorne catches us—" "Silas Thorne is miles away, mending fences on the North Ridge," Judd snapped, cutting the sheriff off. "And by the time he gets back, the widow Bennett will have signed the estate over to me, and we'll be sitting comfortably in town with a legally binding document." Judd turned his cold, calculating gaze down to Clara. Clara didn't cower. She pushed herself up to her feet, ignoring the stinging in her scraped hands. She looked her brother-in-law dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of the stone-cold stoicism Silas had shown her. "You're a coward, Judd," Clara said, her voice echoing sharply against the canyon walls. "You waited until Silas was gone because you know he'd bury you where you stand." Judd's aristocratic mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the ugly, festering insecurity beneath. He stepped forward and delivered a backhanded slap across Clara's face. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side. She tasted the sharp metallic tang of copper as her lips split against her teeth, but she didn't fall. She slowly turned her head back, spitting a drop of blood into the dirt at Judd's polished boots. Harlan Vance chuckled from the porch. "Got a mouth on her, don't she, boss? Silas must like 'em fiery." "Shut up, Harlan," Judd hissed. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of legal parchment. He snapped it open, holding it up so the harsh sunlight illuminated the heavy black ink. "Let's dispense with the familial pleasantries, Clara," Judd said smoothly. "Arthur was a fool, but he wasn't a complete idiot. I know he gave you the deed to the aquifer basin before he died, and I know you still have it. I want it." "It belongs to Liam," Clara said fiercely. "It's his inheritance. You have no right to it." "I have every right," Judd roared, the veneer of the sophisticated banker shattering. "I built the Bennett name in this town. I bought the bank, I bribed the judges, I laid the groundwork. Arthur was nothing but a dirt-poor horsebreaker. He stumbled onto that basin out of pure dumb luck. I won't let a fortune slip through my fingers because my brother wanted to play pioneer." Judd shoved the paper toward her. "This," Judd said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "is a promissory note. It states that Arthur Bennett borrowed $15,000 from my bank, using his hidden estate as collateral. It is signed, dated, and witnessed by the good Sheriff Hayes here." Clara stared at the paper. "It's a forgery. Arthur never borrowed a dime from you. He despised you. It doesn't matter what Arthur thought. He's dead. Judd smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. It only matters what the law says. And the law, represented by Sheriff Hayes, says this document is authentic. Which means, Clara, you are in possession of stolen property. You owe me the deed. Clara looked from the forged paper to the sweating sheriff, and finally to the leering face of Harlan Vance. The puzzle pieces Silas had laid out the night before snapped together with terrifying clarity. Arthur was an expert writer, Clara whispered, the realization settling like ice in her veins. The coroner said his horse spooked, said he was dragged through the brush, but Arthur could break the wildest bronc in the territory. He didn't fall. Judd didn't say a word. He merely adjusted his cuffs. It was Harlan Vance who stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the gravel. The scarred cowboy flipped his hunting knife into the air and caught it by the handle. He fought hard, I'll give him that, Harlan sneered, his eyes glittering with malicious pride. But a man can't stay in the saddle when someone shoots his horse out from under him in the pitch black. A terrible tragedy, Mrs. Bennett. Real terrible. The world seemed to stop spinning. The hot canyon air rushed out of Clara's lungs. They had murdered him, the father of her children, the man she had loved for 11 years, butchered in the dirt for a piece of paper so Judd could control the county's water. And now the men who had orchestrated his death were standing right in front of her, demanding the spoils of their slaughter. The grief that had weighed Clara down for the past 3 months evaporated. It didn't turn to sadness. It turned to pure, unadulterated hatred. "I'll see you hang, Judd," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but vibrating with lethal intent. "Both of you. I swear it on my sons' lives." Judd sighed, feigning exhaustion. "I was hoping we could do this civilly, Clara, but you forced my hand." He gestured lazily to Harlan. "Hold her down. Break her fingers one by one until she tells us where the deed is. And if she still won't talk, we'll ride back to Silver Creek and see how much pain the little one— Toby, is it? Let's see how much pain he can take before his mother breaks." The threat against her 5-year-old son hit Clara like a physical electric shock. The maternal instinct, wild and violent, overrode everything else. She couldn't wait for Silas. Silas had offered her his name as a fortress, but a fortress was useless if the gates were breached from the inside. Silas had taught her that out here, you don't wait for rescue, you survive. Clara let out a choked, desperate sob, allowing her knees to buckle. She collapsed into the dirt, burying her face in her hands, playing the exact role Judd expected her to play, the helpless, broken, terrified widow. "No! Please!" Clara wept, her voice high and frantic. "Please don't touch my boys! I'll give it to you! I'll give you everything!" Judd raised a hand, stopping Harlan in his tracks. A smug, triumphant smile spread across the banker's face. He looked at Sheriff Hayes, his eyes gleaming with victory. "You see, Sheriff? Just takes a little persuasion to make a woman see reason." Judd looked down at Clara, his shadow falling over her huddled form. "Where is it, Clara?" It's in the wagon," Clara stammered between fake, ragged sobs, pointing a trembling finger toward the wooden bed of the wagon she had just been thrown from. "Under the floorboards, there's a false bottom beneath the supply sacks. I hid it there." Judd's eyes lit up with unvarnished greed. He took a step toward the wagon, but paused, his cowardice winning out. He turned to Harlan. "Get in there and find it. Tear the floorboards up if you have to." Harlan rolled his eyes, sheathing his knife. "Ain't no need to tear up a perfectly good wagon, boss. I'll get your damn paper." Harlan turned his back on Clara, stepping up onto the rear axle of the wagon and leaning his upper body over the wooden tailgate, digging his hands beneath the heavy canvas supply sacks. Judd was watching Harlan. Sheriff Hayes was scanning the horizon, praying no one was coming. For 3 crucial seconds, no one was looking at Clara Thorne. Clara didn't hesitate. The facade of the weeping widow vanished instantly. She moved with a terrifying, silent speed that she hadn't known she possessed. She scrambled to her feet, lunging toward the side of the wagon. She didn't reach for the floorboards. She reached for the thick leather scabbard strapped to the exterior of the wagon's bench seat. A scabbard Silas had quietly bolted there 3 days ago, telling her that a frontier woman should never ride unarmed. Clara's blistered, calloused fingers closed around the cold, oiled walnut stock of the Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. She ripped the rifle from the leather sheath. The sheer weight of the steel grounded her, sending a jolt of lethal adrenaline straight into her heart. She spun around, taking 2 steps back into the open dirt of the canyon. With a fluid, violent motion, Clara racked the heavy steel lever downward and snapped it back up. Clack, clack! The distinct, unmistakable, terrifying sound of a chambering bullet echoed off the jagged canyon walls like a thunderclap. Harlan Vance froze, his arms still buried under the canvas sacks. Sheriff Hayes jumped nearly a foot in the air, his hand freezing halfway to his holster. Judd Bennett whipped around, his smug smile instantly melting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Clara Bennett, Clara Thorne, stood in the center of the dust. Her gray dress was torn, her lip was bleeding, and her hair was falling out of its pins. But her feet were planted shoulder-width apart, the stock of the Winchester tucked perfectly into the pocket of her shoulder, her left hand supporting the heavy barrel with dead-steady precision. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked exactly like Silas Thorne's wife. The black iron sights of the rifle were aimed squarely, unflinchingly, at the center of Judd Bennett's chest. "I told you, Judd," Clara said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly calm that held not a single tremor of fear. "I am not giving you my son's future. Put your hands in the air, or I will drop you right where you stand." The standoff in Willow Creek Canyon had just begun, and Clara Thorne was no longer running. The heavy silence in Willow Creek Canyon was thicker than the midday heat, broken only by the ragged, terrified breathing of Sheriff Hayes. Clara Thorne didn't blink. The heavy walnut stock of the Winchester 1873 was pulled tight into her shoulder, the iron sights leveled dead center on Judd Bennett's silk vest. Her finger rested lightly, dangerously, on the trigger. "Put the paper down, Judd," Clara commanded, her voice ringing off the jagged canyon walls with the sharp authority of a cracking whip. "Put the forged note on the dirt and kick your gun away, now!" Judd's face had drained of its aristocratic color, leaving him a sickly, pallid gray. His eyes darted from the black muzzle of the rifle to Clara's face, searching for a tremor, a hesitation. He found nothing but absolute, lethal resolve. "Clara, be reasonable," Judd stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture, the forged promissory note trembling between his fingers. "You shoot me, and Hayes will hang you for murder. Your boys will be orphans." "Sheriff Hayes is an accessory to the murder of his own constituent," Clara shot back, her gaze flickering to the sweating lawman for a fraction of a second before locking back onto Judd. "He knows it. And he knows if I pull this trigger, Harlan Vance is going to shoot me, and then Harlan is going to shoot him, so there are no witnesses left to claim Arthur's land. Isn't that right, Sheriff?" Hayes swallowed hard, his face turning a mottled purple. He slowly lifted his hands away from his gun belt. Judd, I ain't dying for a water deed. Let the woman go." "Shut up, you fool," Judd hissed. Harlan Vance, still standing by the wagon, let out a low, ugly whistle. The scarred ranch hand slowly raised his hands, showing his empty palms, but his eyes were calculating, measuring the distance between his boot and the revolver strapped to his thigh. "Gotta hand it to you, Mrs. Bennett. You got sand, but you ain't gonna shoot all 3 of us before I put a bullet in your gut." "She won't have to." The voice rolled down from the canyon ridge like a physical avalanche, deep, gravelly, and vibrating with absolute murder. Everyone froze. At the crest of the western ridge, silhouetted against the blinding midday sun, sat Silas Thorne. He was mounted on his massive black gelding, looking down at the canyon floor like a vengeful god of the frontier. A second Winchester rifle was resting casually across the pommel of his saddle, the barrel angled downward. Sheriff Hayes let out a whimpering gasp and dropped to his knees in the dust. Judd stumbled backward, his polished boots catching on a rock. "Thorne, listen to me. We were just—" "I heard exactly what you were," Silas cut him off, the coldness in his voice turning the hot canyon air to ice. He spurred the gelding, the horse picking its way down the steep, rocky incline with terrifying speed. Silas didn't ride between Clara and the men. He didn't order her to lower her weapon, and he didn't take over her fight. He rode to her left flank, his horse dancing nervously in the dust as he leveled his own rifle at Harlan Vance. He looked at his wife, saw the blood on her split lip, and felt a homicidal rage spike in his chest. But he also saw the unyielding iron in her posture. "You heard my wife, Judd," Silas said softly. "Drop the paper." Judd's fingers went slack. The forged deed fluttered to the dirt. "Now, Sheriff," Silas drawled, not taking his eyes off Harlan. "Take your handcuffs off your belt. Lock Judd to the wagon wheel. Do it slow." Hayes scrambled to obey, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the iron cuffs twice before managing to click them around Judd's wrist and the heavy wooden spokes of the wagon wheel. "Silas, you can't do this," Judd screamed, yanking against the iron chain. "I own the judges. I own the town." "I wired the U.S. Marshals from the telegraph office an hour ago," Silas stated, his voice flat. "Told them the local sheriff was covering up a murder for water rights. They're riding in from Cheyenne. Your judges can't save you from a federal noose, Judd." Harlan Vance realized in that split second that he was a dead man. If the marshals arrived, he would hang for Arthur Bennett's murder. If he surrendered, Silas Thorne would likely beat him to death anyway for putting his hands on Clara. A cornered rat only had one play left. Harlan didn't reach for the gun on his hip. He reached behind his back, slipping a hidden derringer from his waistband. He didn't aim at Silas. He aimed squarely at Clara's chest. "Clara!" Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't try to aim and fire his rifle. There wasn't time. He kicked his boots out of the stirrups and launched his massive frame out of the saddle, throwing himself entirely across Clara's line of sight, just as the canyon echoed with a sharp crack. The .41 caliber bullet tore into Silas's side just below his ribs. The impact knocked him out of the air. He hit the dirt hard, taking Clara down with him in a tangle of limbs and dust. Clara's rifle discharged wildly into the sky as she fell. "Silas!" Clara screamed, the world tilting on its axis as she saw the bright crimson blood blossoming across his dark shirt. Harlan dropped the empty derringer, drawing his heavy Colt revolver to finish the job. But Silas Thorne was not a man who stayed down. Ignoring the burning agony in his side, Silas rolled, using his momentum to sweep Harlan's legs out from under him. The scarred cowboy hit the ground, his gunshot going wide, tearing a chunk of wood out of the wagon. Before Harlan could cock the hammer again, Silas was on top of him. It wasn't a gentleman's duel. It was a brutal, visceral explosion of frontier violence. Silas grabbed Harlan's gun hand and smashed it against a jagged rock until the bones shattered and the revolver dropped into the dust. Harlan howled, bringing his left knee up to drive it into Silas's bullet wound. Silas grunted, his vision flashing white with pain. But the phantom ghosts of 10 years ago fueled his fists. Harlan had tried to kill his wife. He had threatened his boys. Silas drove his fist into Harlan's face with the force of a swinging anvil. Bone crunched. He hit him again and again, the raw, bloody knuckles connecting until Harlan's eyes rolled back in his head and he went entirely limp in the dirt. Silas stopped, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He stayed over the unconscious man for a second longer, making sure the threat was neutralized before the adrenaline began to bleed away, taking his strength with it. He slumped backward, collapsing into the red dust of the canyon floor. "Silas!" Clara was there instantly, her hands desperately pressing against the bleeding wound in his side. Her tears, the ones she had refused to shed for Judd, fell freely now, mixing with the dust and blood on Silas's shirt. "Look at me," Clara sobbed, pressing her forehead against his chest, feeling the weak, rapid thump of his heart. "Don't you dare leave me, Silas Thorne. You promised you were a wall. You don't get to crumble." Silas reached up with a heavy, trembling hand. His bloody fingers gently traced the line of her jaw, wiping away a tear. He looked at the fierce, beautiful, terrifying woman who had just fought a canyon full of killers for her family. "Not crumbling," Silas managed to whisper, a faint, blood-stained smile touching his lips. "Just resting my eyes a minute, Clara." His hand fell into the dirt, and Silas Thorne knew no more. The first thing Silas registered was the smell. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the choking dust of the canyon. It was the rich, earthy aroma of brewing Arbuckle's coffee, mingled with the faint, sweet scent of lye soap and lavender. He tried to draw a deep breath, but a sharp, pulling fire in his right side stopped him short. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. The harsh midday sun had been replaced by the soft, golden light of late afternoon, filtering through the lace curtains of the master bedroom in the Silver Creek main house. He was lying in a real bed, propped up on clean white pillows. His torso was tightly bound in fresh linen bandages. "Don't try to move." Doc Marsh said the bullet cracked a rib, but it went clean through. Silas turned his head. Clara was sitting in a wooden rocking chair by the bedside. She had washed the dust from her hair, and the split on her lip was beginning to heal, but dark circles of exhaustion shadowed her brown eyes. She held a damp cloth in her hands, her knuckles still bruised from the canyon. "How long?" Silas rasped, his throat feeling like sandpaper. 3 days, Clara said, her voice impossibly gentle. She stood up, poured a glass of water from the nightstand pitcher, and carefully helped him lift his head to drink. "You had a fever the first night. You fought it off." Silas fell back against the pillows, the events of the canyon rushing back. "Judd? The boys?" "The boys are safe. They're out front with Liam. He's showing them how to whittle," Clara said, setting the glass down. A fierce, satisfied light entered her eyes. "The U.S. Marshals arrived an hour after you passed out. Hayes sang like a canary to save his own neck. He gave them everything: the forged note, the bribes, and the truth about Arthur. And Judd? Federal custody in Cheyenne, along with Harlan Vance. They'll both hang before the winter snows hit," Clara said flatly. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the heavy parchment deed. "The Marshals secured the water rights. I had the town lawyer draw up an ironclad trust this morning. It belongs to Liam, Caleb, and Toby. No one can ever touch it again." Silas looked at her. She had handled the law, the ranch, and his near death without breaking stride. She was magnificent. He looked down at his own hands resting on the quilt. 10 years ago, he had lost everything, and the grief had turned him into a ghost haunting his own land. He had believed that caring for anyone was a fatal weakness. But lying here, with the ache in his side and the sound of his stepsons laughing through the open window, he realized the truth. He had taken a bullet for Clara, and instead of paralyzing fear, he felt an overwhelming, profound peace. He hadn't failed. He had fought for something real, and he had won. "Clara," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "In the top drawer of my desk, there's a heavy manila envelope. Bring it here. And bring a pen." Clara frowned, confused, but she walked out to his study and returned a moment later with the envelope and a fountain pen. She handed them to him. Silas winced as he shifted his weight, breaking the wax seal on the envelope. He pulled out a stack of legal documents. "I had the town lawyer draw these up the day we got married. But I was too much of a coward to sign them," Silas confessed, looking down at the papers. "I told myself I was just providing a name to keep Judd away. An arrangement. I told myself I didn't want to be a father again because it hurt too much to lose them." He looked up, his storm-colored eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. "I was a damn fool. I don't want an arrangement, Clara. I want everything." Silas uncapped the pen. He pressed the nib to the bottom of the thick parchment, his hand steady as a rock, and signed his name with a heavy, deliberate flourish. He handed the papers to Clara. Clara looked down. They were formal legal adoption papers. At the bottom, in Silas's bold handwriting, he had legally claimed Liam, Caleb, and Toby as his own sons, the Thorne brothers. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, splashing onto the ink. She pressed her hand over her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips, Silas. I'm not going anywhere, Clara, Silas promised, his voice thick with emotion. I'm staying right here, with my family. You stubborn, foolish cowboy, Clara wept, leaning down to press her forehead against his. She didn't care about the bandages or the dirt. She wrapped her arms carefully around his neck, inhaling the scent of lye soap, leather, and the man who had given her back the world. 2 weeks later, the brutal summer heat finally broke, giving way to the cool, crisp evening breezes of early autumn. The sun was sinking below the western ridge, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple, burnt orange, and spun gold. The Silver Creek Ranch was bathed in the golden hour light. In the front yard, Caleb and Toby were chasing the ranch's sheepdog in circles, shrieking with laughter, while Liam sat on the corral fence, proudly wearing a Stetson Silas had bought him in town. The heavy wooden front door of the main house creaked open. Silas stepped out onto the porch. He was moving slower than usual, a slight limp in his step, and his right arm resting carefully by his side. But he was dressed in clean denim and a fresh cotton shirt. Clara was sitting on the wooden porch swing, a bowl of unshelled peas resting in her lap. She looked up as he walked out, a warm, soft smile spreading across her face. Silas didn't ask for permission. He walked over, gently lifted the bowl from her lap, and set it on the small table. He sat down heavily beside her on the swing, letting out a long, contented sigh as the chains creaked in protest beneath his weight. He stretched his left arm out along the back of the swing, his large hand coming to rest on Clara's shoulder. She leaned into him immediately, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat. They sat in companionable silence, watching the boys play as the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky. The ghosts of the past, the fever, the stampede, the canyon, seemed 1,000,000 miles away. Silas turned his head, pressing a lingering, tender kiss into the crown of Clara's hair. "I told you I'd build a wall for you," Silas whispered, his deep voice vibrating against her ear. Clara tilted her head up, meeting his eyes. The hardened, isolated cowboy who had found her on the dusty streets of Willow Creek was gone. In his place was a man anchored by love, fiercely protective and finally completely at peace. Clara reached up, her calloused fingers gently tracing the faded scar on his cheek. She smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears and absolute certainty. "You didn't build a wall, cowboy," Clara said softly, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of sweet autumn air and forever. "You built a home,